A young priestess speaks to a guild worker saying she wants to become an adventurer. The worker gives her a tag showing she's at the beginner level, called porcelain rank. Just then, a group of young adventurers approaches and invites her to join their team. They tell her they plan to take on a mission to kill goblins. The guild worker suggests an easier quest, but they refuse. The group's leader, a boy with a sword, says he's already dealt with goblins before, and it should be an easy job for good money. He also tells her his team includes a swordswoman and a sage, so they don't need help. The girls in the group, growing impatient, ask the priestess again if she wants to join. She finally agrees. As they leave, the guild worker looks at them with concern. The group goes straight to a cave where goblins live. The leader tells the priestess they couldn't afford potions or weapons due to a lack of money. The priestess gets worried and asks if they're taking on too much. The others laugh at her, calling her scared. Suddenly, goblins attack. The sage casts a fire spell on one goblin but is soon overwhelmed by others. They begin to assault her. The priestess tries to help by using her holy staff, and the leader bravely charges in with his sword. But the goblins prove too strong, and one stabs him in the stomach. The swordswoman tries to protect the other two girls, but she is overpowered and beaten by the goblins. The priestess, crying and scared, apologizes to the swordswoman and tries to flee with the sage. However, the goblins catch up. The priestess is hit with an arrow, and the sage is captured. The goblins look at the priestess with evil intent. Just when all hope seems lost, a shadowy figure appears and saves her from the goblins. He introduces himself as the Goblin Slayer. The Goblin Slayer quickly kills the goblins and learns that the priestess is a new adventurer. He then turns to the sage, who is bleeding and poisoned. The sage asks to be put out of her misery, but the priestess offers to heal her using her special miracle powers. The Goblin Slayer, however, says it's too late and kills the sage. He then instructs the priestess to use light magic to blind the goblin leader approaching them. She does, and the Goblin Slayer kills the leader, sending his body into the group of goblins. The two make their way deeper into the cave and find a goblin assaulting the swordswoman. The Goblin Slayer kills it and then destroys the baby goblins, despite the priestess hesitating. Later, the priestess learns that many beginner adventurers go goblin hunting and never return. Those who survive are often so traumatized that they live isolated in temples. Despite this, the priestess is determined to follow the Goblin Slayer. After buying armor for protection, the priestess approaches the Goblin Slayer again, telling him she now has chainmail and wants to join him on more adventures. Meanwhile, a farm girl has a dream about leaving a young boy behind to go to the city. It turns out the boy in the dream was a younger version of the Goblin Slayer. In the dream, she regrets not apologizing to him before leaving. The farm girl wakes up and sees the Goblin Slayer checking the area for goblin tracks. He examines the ground and the fence to make sure everything is safe. The girl tells him he doesn't need to do this and invites him to breakfast, which he accepts. Later, the Goblin Slayer has breakfast with the farm girl and her uncle. He pays his rent, and the uncle notes that he's paying more than expected. The Goblin Slayer explains that he has been getting more requests to kill goblins recently. The Goblin Slayer tells the farm girl's uncle that he's heading back to the guild to find new quests. The farm girl offers to go with him since she also plans to sell some produce at the market. As they leave, the uncle gives the Goblin Slayer a disapproving look. When they reach the guild, the farm girl hears people calling the Goblin Slayer strange because he only accepts quests to kill goblins, even though he's a silver-ranked adventurer. The farm girl waits patiently for him, but she's surprised to see him with a young priestess. She realizes this must be the adventurer the Goblin Slayer had recently mentioned. The Goblin Slayer takes 3 goblin-killing quests, and the priestess offers to join him. He informs the farm girl that he'll be gone for several days, and she patiently waits for his return. Her uncle warns her that the Goblin Slayer has been unstable since a tragic event years ago, and says his obsession with goblin hunting will lead to his death. However, the farm girl insists that he will always come back, and she promises to wait for him no matter what. Meanwhile, the Goblin Slayer is seen hunting goblins. He uses fiery arrows and gasoline to burn their hideout, instructing the priestess to trap them inside with her magic. She does as asked, but becomes emotional, feeling pity for the goblins and asking why such harsh methods are necessary. The Goblin Slayer silently remembers the day goblins attacked his village, killing his sister while he hid in fear. After completing the mission, they return to the guild. The guild attendant is relieved to see the Goblin Slayer safe. Later, he goes home, where the farm girl is happy to see him unharmed. She asks if she should prepare a meal for him, and he agrees. Later, a high elf enters the guild, attracting attention. She approaches the guild attendant, asking for an adventurer named Orpold. The attendant says she doesn't know anyone by that name. A dwarf steps forward, correcting her and saying they are looking for someone named Beard Cutter. The guild attendant says she doesn't know that name either. Finally, a lizard man apologizes for his companions and explains that they are actually looking for the Goblin Slayer. At that moment, the Goblin Slayer arrives and asks if someone mentioned goblins. The guild attendant introduces him to the trio, and she finds it odd that elves, dwarves, and lizard men are working together. The young priestess overhears the conversation and tries to follow the Goblin Slayer, but he advises her not to. He goes into a meeting with the trio, while some new adventurers try to convince the priestess to stop working with him, but she refuses. A sorceress approaches the priestess, telling her about an odd request the Goblin Slayer had made, asking for an ancient scroll. She questions why the priestess sticks with him instead of joining a group that hunts bigger monsters. Meanwhile, the trio tells the Goblin Slayer they need his help to defeat the Demon Lord's army. However, the Goblin Slayer says he isn't interested in anything but killing goblins. The elf gets frustrated, but the lizard man explains that their main reason for seeking him out is to deal with a nest of goblins attacking an elven village. The goblins have already captured the sister of the person who sent them, and the adventurer who went after her is now missing. The trio reveals they are silver-ranked adventurers too and were sent to assist him. The Goblin Slayer agrees to take on the quest, surprising the elf with his eagerness. After informing the guild attendant, the young priestess offers to join him, and the trio says they will come too. During their journey, they camp for the night. The elf shares her travel rations, the dwarf offers fire wine, which makes the elf blush, but everyone is surprised when it doesn't affect the Goblin Slayer. The elf asks him to share something of his, so he gives them cheese given to him by the farm girl. He also tells them a story his sister once told him. Goblins come from the moon, and when people get greedy or try to take things by force, they turn into goblins. The next day, the group sets out to find the goblins. Hitty out. They spot some goblins near a cave, and the elven girl takes down 2 with her arrows. After dealing with the remaining goblin scouts, they enter the cave and find a strange, advanced device. The Goblin Slayer notes that this goblin group lacks a shaman, as such advanced technology would be used by one. He concludes that they are being led by a highly intelligent being. The group searches the cave for the goblins' main hideout. The dwarf locates them on the left side of the cave, but the Goblin Slayer insists they check the right side. Following the right side, they discover the missing elven woman tied to a wall. She tells the Goblin Slayer to kill her, but he charges at her. The others try to stop him, but he kills a goblin hiding behind her legs. The group is relieved, realizing he was only targeting the goblin. The lizard man summons Iguanodera, a lizard creature made from the bones of his ancestors, to take the rescued girl back to the elven village. After Iguanodera leaves, the lizard man reveals he can only use his powers one more time. The young priestess also mentions she has limited use of her powers. They continue deeper into the cave and find the goblins sleeping. The dwarf casts a sleeping spell on the goblins to keep them from alerting their leader. The group then attacks the sleeping goblins. The elven girl, remembering the girl's suffering, stabs the goblins repeatedly. The goblin leader, an orc, appears and is angered by the Goblin Slayer's lack of respect for his species. The lizardman summons Iguanodera again to fight the orc, but the orc deflects their attacks and launches a massive fireball. The priestess protects them with a divine shield. When the shield wears off, the group attacks the orc. It sends the Goblin Slayer flying and knocks the others around. The priestess rushes to the Goblin Slayer, giving him a healing and stamina potion. Once revived, the Goblin Slayer reveals a new plan. He uses an ancient scroll to cast a powerful spell that slices the orc in half. The others are shocked as he finishes the orc with a deep cut to the forehead. The priestess realizes this must be the scroll the sorceress mentioned. After killing the remaining goblins, they exit the cave and find a carriage waiting for them. An elven man asks how many goblins are left, but the group ignores him and boards the carriage. As they travel, the elven girl asks the priestess if the Goblin Slayer has always worked alone. The priestess confirms this, and the elven girl is moved, promising to introduce the Goblin Slayer to a proper adventure in the future before falling asleep. Later, the Goblin Slayer inspects the farmhouse fence for goblin signs when the farm girl approaches. She asks about his health, and he says there are no signs of goblins. She also asks if he plans to work with the new adventurers again, and he implies he might. The Goblin Slayer heads to the guild, where the lizardman, dwarf, and elven girl approach him. The lizardman is eager for more cheese, which the Goblin Slayer provides. The elven girl asks if he will join them in future adventures, and he agrees to consider it. Later, some rookie adventurers go on a quest to kill large mice. They succeed, but lose a sword during a retreat from giant cockroaches. The boy tries to borrow a weapon from others, but finds no help. He asks the Goblin Slayer for advice, who suggests using a club, as it's just as effective as a sword. The adventurers return to the cave, kill more rats with the club, and eventually retrieve the sword from the largest roach. Meanwhile, the Goblin Slayer supervises a promotion exam for rookies. One rookie, demoted for stealing treasure, reacts badly and attempts to attack the guild attendant. After the promotion exam, the Goblin Slayer helps the guild attendant by putting the troublemaker rookie in his place and chasing him away. As the guild attendant's friend teases her about her apparent crush on the Goblin Slayer, a message arrives for him. The guild attendant is surprised to see that it's from the Sword Maiden, the Archbishop, asking for the Goblin Slayer. Later, a hero and her party successfully defeat the Demon Lord. The news spreads quickly through the guild, and people celebrate the Demon Lord's death. However, the Goblin Slayer remains indifferent and informs the priestess and the odd party that he has received a new quest, to kill goblins. They agree to join him, but the elven girl and the priestess insist he promise not to use explosives, fire, or poison. The group travels to the capital, where they find out their client is the Sword Maiden, a top-ranked adventurer and a legend for defeating the Demon Lord before his reincarnation. The priestess is nervous meeting her. At the temple, the Sword Maiden explains that bodies of young girls and women have been found in the streets, and a scout reported seeing a goblin attack a little girl before killing it. She asks for their help in eliminating the goblins hiding in the canals beneath the temple and offers them gold for their success. She provides an old map of the canal, and the group heads into the tunnels. They encounter goblins, and despite the increasing numbers, the Goblin Slayer orders the priestess to trap them with a magical cage after using pepper spray on them. The priestess scolds him for the pain caused to the goblins, but he remains silent. Hearing flowing water, they investigate and find an army of goblins. They try to escape, but come across an alligator. The Goblin Slayer suggests using the alligator to their advantage, leading the goblins to it. The alligator eats the goblins, allowing the party to move on. The Goblin Slayer notes that the goblins seem to have been unnaturally mobilized, suggesting an intelligent force is behind them. He plans to return to the canals to deal with this threat. After leaving the canal, the priestess invites the others for a bath, but they decline. The Goblin Slayer mentions he has an errand. While the priestess bathes at the temple, the Sword Maiden joins her. She warns that the Goblin Slayer's dangerous quests might end badly and expresses concern for him. The priestess wonders if she can prevent this, but realizes that even if he survives, he may eventually become unable to hunt goblins. The Sword Maiden reveals a scar on her back, showing she knows the pain of being captured by goblins, which makes the priestess reconsider her feelings about the quest. The next day, they return to the hideout but find the canal silent. They enter an unlocked room only to be trapped inside. Poison gas begins seeping in, and they cover their noses to avoid poisoning. Once the gas clears, goblins rush in, and while the priestess defends them with a magical shield, it eventually wears off. The goblins overpower the Goblin Slayer and his party. The Goblin Lord enters, throws the Goblin Slayer against the wall, and attacks the odd party. The elven girl is pinned down, and the Goblin Lord bites her arm. The Goblin Slayer, seeing her suffering, recalls his own pain from his sister's death. He rises and attacks the Goblin Lord from behind, stabbing him in the eyes. The Goblin Lord, stunned and in pain, stumbles, causing the goblins to lose their balance. The odd party seizes the opportunity, and the remaining goblins flee in fear. The Goblin Slayer checks on the priestess to make sure she's okay. After confirming she's fine, he collapses beside her. The odd party, exhausted from the battle, also joins them. Later, the Goblin Slayer wakes up naked and finds the priestess sleeping naked beside him. He realizes that he was revived through a resurrection spell that required him to sleep naked with a virgin. The Sword Maiden then enters the room and shares her own painful past, revealing that she was raped by goblins 10 years ago. She confides that if people knew she was afraid of goblins, they would mock her. She asks if she can trust the Goblin Slayer to help her, and leaves before the priestess wakes up. The priestess, embarrassed to see the Goblin Slayer awake before her, asks if he saw anything, but he reassures her that she has no scars. After dressing, the odd party enters. The elven girl tells the Goblin Slayer that the priestess cried when he didn't wake up the previous day. The dwarf and the lizard man reveal they haven't eaten since the battle, waiting for him so they could share their first meal together. After eating, the Goblin Slayer and the priestess go to the blacksmith to get their armor repaired. The next day, they head back to the canal with the odd party to deal with the remaining goblins. They discover a large eye that can shoot fire and nullify spells. The Goblin Slayer instructs the dwarf to put it to sleep and trap it after he throws gas at it. The eye catches fire and dies along with the goblins in the room. Further into the canal, they find a mirror that shows goblins preparing boats on the other side. The Goblin Slayer realizes the goblins are using this mirror for some plan and are still in the canal. A horde of goblins, led by the Goblin Lord, rushes toward them. The Goblin Slayer notes that the mirror can absorb objects and directs the lizard man and dwarf to carry it. He lures the Goblin Lord toward the mirror, causing it to crash into it. The priestess and the dwarf use this opportunity to defeat the remaining goblins. Afterward, the Goblin Slayer asks the dwarf to coat the mirror in concrete and sink it in a river to prevent misuse. Returning to the Sword Maiden, the Goblin Slayer confronts her about her possible involvement in the recent crimes. She admits that goblins don't kill their victims quickly, but torment them first. She had pretended to be a goblin to show the villagers the horrors of being captured by them. The Goblin Slayer, understanding her pain, decides not to punish her, but offers to help her whenever she needs it. Back at the guild, the Goblin Slayer plans to make ice treats, a dessert he hasn't had since his sister's death. In the kitchen, he finds the farm girl cooking and agrees to have breakfast with her. He reminisces about his childhood, his envy of a friend who left for the city, and how his sister had advised him that envy makes people like goblins. He remembers her cooking his favorite dishes and telling him to apologize to his friend. The next day, the Goblin Slayer steps out for his routine check. The farm girl, surprised to see him without his helmet, invites him to breakfast with her and her uncle. He agrees and joins them. Her father reacts with shock upon seeing him without his helmet, questioning if the Goblin Slayer has given up on his quest. The Goblin Slayer responds that even though the Demon Lord is dead, goblins are still a threat. The Goblin Slayer checks with the farm girl to see if she noticed anything unusual, but she hasn't. Before leaving for the guild, the farm girl offers to accompany him. As he loads supplies into the carriage, her uncle approaches and asks him to be careful with his niece. At the guild, the farm girl runs errands, and the Goblin Slayer is surprised to find that some adventurers don't recognize him and treat him kindly. He stops by the blacksmith to pick up his armor, noticing an adventurer training rookies. At the guild, the young priestess informs him that her arm has fully healed. They meet the guild assistant, who gives the Goblin Slayer a letter from the Sword Maiden. The priestess wonders why she wrote, and the Goblin Slayer learns that the Sword Maiden's nightmares about goblins have stopped, and things are improving in the capital. The odd party arrives and asks why the Goblin Slayer didn't visit them if he was around. They invite him to eat with them, but he declines, citing business. The farm girl walks in, surprising everyone. The elven girl is disappointed to learn that the Goblin Slayer had plans with the farm girl, which is why he declined her invitation. The group invites the farm girl to join them at their table. Later, the dwarf and the elven girl compete in a drinking contest, and the guild cheers them on as they drink through the night. The next morning, the farm girl prepares breakfast cheerfully. The Goblin Slayer arrives and urgently tells her to flee because he has spotted goblin footprints in the woods. He estimates that hundreds of goblin scouts, likely part of the Goblin King's army, are heading towards the farmhouse. Despite his warnings about the gruesome fate of previous captives, the farm girl insists on staying because she trusts him and wants to be by his side. The Goblin Slayer tries to dissuade her, but ultimately leaves for the guild. The farm girl's uncle notices her distress and tells the Goblin Slayer not to upset his niece. At the guild, the Goblin Slayer announces that he needs help to defend the village from the goblin army. The adventurers are initially reluctant, and the elven girl is angry but controls herself. An adventurer demands payment, and the Goblin Slayer offers personal belongings as compensation. Eventually, the guild attendant offers a gold coin to anyone who helps. Motivated by the extra reward, the adventurers prepare for battle. That night, they lay in wait and ambush the goblins when they attack the farmhouse. The goblins, caught by surprise, are met with a wall of spears and arrows. Some try to flee, but are killed by rookie adventurers. A female adventurer praises the Goblin Slayer's strategy for making the fight easier. Meanwhile, another adventurer is attacked by a goblin lord who flings him toward the other adventurers. The presence of multiple goblin lords alarms everyone. The Goblin Slayer, having left the others to fight goblins, confronts the Goblin King. He stops him with an imposing helmet that reflects red light. The Goblin King, frustrated and desperate, tries to flee and get back to his captives. The Goblin Slayer reveals that he has already destroyed the Goblin King's nest and rescued the captives. The Goblin King, enraged, attacks the Goblin Slayer. They clash, but the Goblin Slayer is thrown to the ground, and the Goblin King stomps on his head repeatedly. As the Goblin King raises his sword to decapitate the Goblin Slayer, the priestess emerges from the forest, using her magic to trap the Goblin King and strike him with lightning. The Goblin King stumbles, and the priestess quickly heals the Goblin Slayer, scolding him for always putting himself at such risk. It's revealed that the Goblin Slayer had deliberately lured the Goblin King into the forest, knowing he couldn't defeat him alone in the open. Meanwhile, the other adventurers face off against a goblin lord. A young goblin attempts to attack from behind, but is saved by the female partner of a veteran soldier. The battle ends with the goblins defeated. The hero who previously vanquished the demon lord arrives in town. She learns about the goblins' defeat at the hands of the Goblin Slayer and decides she must meet him, despite one party member's opinion that goblins are a rookie's challenge. The hero defends the Goblin Slayer, acknowledging that goblins are tricky and dangerous. The town celebrates the goblins' defeat, and the farm girl joyfully welcomes the Goblin Slayer back from his fight with the Goblin King. Later, at the guild, the Goblin Slayer receives a warm reception from the adventurers. He shares his plans to take up more quests and become a full-fledged adventurer. When the priestess asks why he didn't put up a quest earlier, he explains that previous requests for help were dismissed by adventurers who deemed goblins insignificant. The priestess then asks the Goblin Slayer to remove his mask. He takes off his helmet, revealing a strikingly handsome face. The crowd gathers, astonished to see his face for the first time. The priestess smiles, realizing how much the guild members care for him. The community at the guild, who have always seen him as family, will surely support him in the future. The priestess looks up at him, silently promising to stand by him in upcoming battles.